name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We are so pleased to have you with us today. Today's webinar is Photographing Flowers for Transparency, Composition, and Photography. In this detailed presentation, Harold will show several floral arrangements and the patterns behind these images. There will be discussion of issues related to systematic botanical composition. Harold will explain concerns related to light box exposure, specific light boxes, ambient, and additional lighting, and suggest strategies for optimizing your creative light box work. Many of you know who Harold Davis is, but if you're joining us for the first time today, here's a bit about Harold. Harold Davis is an artist, photographer, and author. His most recent books include Creative Black and White, second edition, and Creative Garden Photography, both from Rocky Nook. Harold is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency and an innovator of digital multi-raw processing and hand HDR processing. Harold is an internationally known photographer. His prints are widely collected and he is a sought-after workshop leader. He is a Moab Master and a Zeiss Ambassador. Harold's website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now I will stop my share and hand it over to Harold.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm really excited to be here. It's a pleasure. So today we're going to do three things. First of all, I've got a slide presentation that is fundamentally a condensed recap of the last presentation from 2 weeks ago. So I'll be excited to show that to you and take any questions as we go along. Then Phyllis has a couple of movies, break out the popcorn, and then I'm going to get to processing images. We'll see how many I get to. I hope to at least do 2 or 3. And as I do both parts of this presentation, my slideshow and image processing, I'd like you to look at 3 things, keep 3 things in mind. Number 1, how is the photography done? That's actually, in some ways, the easiest part of this whole affair, because it's pretty much, once you get it down, you're right above at a 90-degree angle to the composition on the light box. Once you get it down with a decent tripod, it's pretty much always the same every time. There's not a lot of variation there. So number 1, the photography. We'll talk about that. Number 2, what are the styles of composition? What are the different patterns? What are the ways you can arrange flowers on a light box that make any coherent sense? So we'll look at a number of possible approaches to that, and as we go along, keep that in mind. Number 3, and this is a surprisingly important part of the whole thing, is what happens after you do the photography and combine the high key layer stack. There are many options from that point forward, and people who get past the initial part of lightbox photography are usually astounded at the choices, the amount of work you can do after that, and what it takes to finish an image. So hopefully I will have time in this presentation to give you some options and thoughts about ways to go on that. All right, without further ado, let me share my screen and get started. You're in Photographing Flowers for Transparency, Composition and Photography, part 2 of this extended lightbox drama. And Creative Garden Photography is my most recent book. It's also the book that has the most in it about this kind of photography. Again, the publisher said when they picked this image, they said, you will tell people how to do this kind of thing in the book, won't you? And I won't say whether or not I'd been planning to, but I do my best in the book to detail much of it. making great photos of flowers, gardens, landscapes, and the beautiful world around us, and some of my earlier books. So here's what I was just saying about what our agenda is. I'm going to recap things, cases and examples, how you combine an exposure sequence, a canonical form. Well, that's complicated language for here are some ways you can present botanical images, flowers specifically, and have it look like it makes some cohesive compositional sense. And then what do you do to move on from the initial sequence? So these are the three areas that we want to look at very carefully. So quick recap, the original presentation has why do it, who is your mama, life's an illusion, arrangement, exposing, processing, presenting. I think we're going to cut to the chase with the why do it, because most of the people who are here today understand why do it. So here's the quick version for exposure. So the goal is to create a white background, 7 to 10 exposures, start completely overexposed. And those of you who've experimented already with the technique, which is most of you, understand that you could also start at a neutral exposure and move to overexposure. It really doesn't matter which direction you go. Just make sure you get all the exposures in the range. Manual exposure, bracket shutter speeds, not aperture or ISO, and use 1 EV increments. Stop when you get to a neutral exposure and reserve, quote unquote, a high dynamic range automatic blend. So that's the very quickly done review of exposure. Here's an example. This shows a dahlia composition in one of the standard forms of composition, namely up a bush or stalk like a real flower, from 4 seconds at the brightest, shown. I wish I could sort of, point at the thing, but you don't really get to do that. But anyhow, 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, half a second, a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second, a 15th of a second, a 30th of a second to the darkest. A 30th of a second is what your light meter is going to tell you is the right exposure. Here's a somewhat typical underexposure histogram, overexposure histogram. Overexposure, it's pinned to the right. Underexposure, it's pinned to the left. And the point here is that all we care about in this kind of photography is the stuff that's to the right of the midpoint. Okay, I recommend that you get in the habit, generally in photography, when you're using manual exposure, at looking at the histogram as well as what it looks like on the LCD. There will be a button you can press on the back of your camera that for any given situation will show you the exposure histogram. You want to get in the habit of using that because it is simply more accurate than the JPEG rendition of the image. The problem is with the JPEG rendition of the image that appears in your LCD on the back of your camera is that the camera is trying to do what it thinks you want and to make the best possible version of the image. And you don't really want to do that. You want to see the raw data for this kind of exposure. This is the finished version of the dahlia photo. You can see the dahlias show on this side. Here's the 4 second exposure. Here's the 1/30th of a second exposure. And that's what the camera will tell you is the correct exposure. Obviously, it's silhouetted and this side is dark. And this is an example of how you are smarter than your camera. All right. Are there questions before I move on from this? I know this was a quick review. Are there questions about exposing at this point? Speak now or don't forever hold your peace. You could ask it if as it comes up. Um, I have the infamous ambient light question, which is, do I use a reflector or light for the front side? Um, okay, so let me get to that in a second. Will I show the setup? And Trevor no, he makes a statement. He shoots tethered to a laptop, which is a great idea, rather than looking at the rear of his camera. That is great. And what I said still holds. You still want to see the histogram as you're evaluating this kind of photography. But shooting tethered to a laptop is great what I will do instead is describe the setup, and we'll be showing a couple of movies later on, Judy. The basic setup is that the camera is on a tripod perpendicular down on what's on the light box. So the geometry is that it's straight above it. But hopefully we'll give a pretty good idea of the setup. So the answer to Mary Louise's question of do I use a reflector or light for the front side is it depends. But the idea of transparency or translucency is that the flower or arrangement or whatever it is you have as a subject is backlit. So the more you put light from the front, the less translucency you get. So sometimes I photograph in a darkened space. Other times I do put a bit of ambient light on the front, or sometimes even spotlight particular areas, but I do that carefully. For the most part, the light box is the primary light source in this kind of photography. And that means you get very, very different results than when you're photographing by reflected light on the surface of something. You get what the object is translucently. And sometimes, for the most part, that's a very special and spectacular results, but sometimes it can be not so much. I had thought for a while that feathers would be a neat thing to try on a light box, and some do work well. But what turns out is that a fair amount of feathers are what you actually see in a peacock feather is a reflection, not a translucent thing. So peacock feathers, for example, lose their luster when you photograph them with using light through a light box. Yes, Judy, Phyllis will put the link for making the light box. It's on the, or at least she'll put the FAQ for light box work from my website. It's pretty easy to find, and it's about 3/4 of the way down that FAQ. Now, pretty much I do this the same each time. Mary Louise wants to know, did I use any frontal light for the center of those dahlias? And the answer is no. Start with the most overexposed. Use the same Adobe Camera Raw settings on each. Add darker images with layer masks and the brush tool. And consider adding the reversed HDR blend at the top of the stack to add punch. You have to be careful with that HDR blend because of the issue of the gray blurs. We'll take a look at that in the processing segment of this presentation with a couple of images. Here's a layer stack for that dahlia image, starting at the bottom of the stack at 4 seconds. With Photoshop layer stacks, the idea is that when you look down on a layer stack, it's like looking down on a stack of pancakes. You see the top with the butter pat and the maple syrup, and just the top one at 100% normal translucency and 100% opacity and normal blending mode. The idea behind the layer masks, which are the second little thumbnails you see here, is that you can pinpoint control what you want to be in each layer. So black conceals, white reveals with a layer mask associated with a layer. So the point of the rather complicated layer mask stack sandwich you see there on the right is to have the background here be pure white. I ask people to think as a thought experiment, what would happen if you took this bouquet of dahlias and photographed them on a white background using your camera's suggested settings? What would happen to the background? Well, the answer is the background would go gray and it would look a lot like that, a 30th of a second exposure with silhouetted flowers. So you could control that using some fairly complicated lighting, but an alternative way to get this kind of result is by using a layer stack with an exposure blending as shown here. And here are a few examples. And by the way, before we move on from these two examples, the dahlia and this Papaver dawn chorus poppy here, as well as this bouquet arrangement, are one of the standard patterns for design on a light box, which is to have a bouquet of flowers arranged around a stalk, as it were a bouquet in a vase or a bush of flowers, something like that. That people look at that and they say, this is something I could live with. This could be a real floral arrangement. The petals here are another standard pattern. Here's another pattern, which is to have a garden, different stalks coming up in a pattern. This is one of my favorites with the, here you can see here with the clematis and the poppies of several different varieties. I have a question. When you paint, from Maria, when you paint on your layer mask, do you use black and white with variation in brush pressure opacity? Can't remember the term. Or do you use a percentage of, e.g. 50% black? Maria, the term you were looking for was flow. And the way it works is the combination of flow and opacity yields a percentage of black. So I think that's, and then sometimes you, after you've done that, you can make a second adjustment by turning down the overall opacity of the layer. Hope that helps. Let me know if you need further explanation.
Oh, so Harold, I was just thinking, so you always just paint with white or black on the layer mask and you do the adjustments with the flow and the opacity, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, with this kind of photography and this kind of standard processing, I don't promise that I won't make a layer mask with something other than straight black and white someday. And yes, primarily that's easier to control. For the most part, my flow is at 50%. Sometimes I do use it at 100% if I want a totally black, opaque black. We'll have some examples of this coming up. A number of the same general style of light box composition. Here are some of the many, many, many things you can do after you get after you get the layer stack combined, and we're going to look at as many of them as we can. So you can retouch, and that covers a multitude of sins. Back in the bad old or good old days of wet film photography, I did spend a fair amount of time with a paintbrush and spotting paints to spot out dots on my prints. Well, you know, obviously in the digital era, you do the same thing. And lightbox photography is a good way to lightbox photography is a good way to get lots of gribblies visible, because any dirt that you have on your sensor or your lens is probably going to show in the white or light translucent parts, particularly when you stop down the lens for a fair amount of depth of field. You know, you can paint in petals for translucency. I'm going to show at least one example of that technique. You can fiddle with blending modes. In particular, I call your attention to the multiply blending mode for making things darker, the screen blending mode for making things lighter, and the soft light blending mode for increasing contrast. You can paint in white for translucency. You can paint in white to remove gray. You can use an LAB adjustment to remove gray. An LAB inversion is an awfully good and wonderful effect. There are various filters, Topaz Impressions, Topaz Glow, Nik Color FX, Topaz Simplify. You can use textures, backgrounds. You can add a white layer. So we'll see how many of these we get through, but they're all wonderful fun. I have a question from Mary Louise. Is there any benefit to arranging flowers on the light box versus standing the light box up and having flowers in a vase in front of the light box? I guess you'd get a more natural look with the vase with light box behind approach. While arranging on the light box, you can have flower centers pointing toward the camera. Well, obviously I do both. And in fact, there are a series of a couple of webinar recordings of what I call three-dimensional light box photography, which is taking it upright. Really, I would prefer to photograph straight down on a light box, all things being equal, if the geometry of it worked, if I could get far enough above the light box. But of course, the geometry doesn't work. If your subject is really big, you may need to photograph it upright. Also, photographing flowers upright allows one to do things that you can't do with them on the light box, which are you could see the vase, for example. You could see the whole setup if you do it upright. On the other hand, if you put them on the light box itself, there's more chance for actually behind the scenes for more chance for behind the scenes manipulation using things like tacky glue, for example. Phyllis, would you mind putting the three-dimensional light box recording link into the box when you get a chance?
Absolutely, I'll get it in there. I just put in the link to the wonderful list you made on your website that shows like everything organized. So
yeah, there are a ton of recordings, and some of them are on fairly specialized topics like three-dimensional light box photography. I think we did 2 on three-dimensional light box photography back in the mid-months of the pandemic, right, Phyllis? How often do I use museum gel to tack down your flowers? Sometimes. Museum gel is a slightly different product than this clear gel tacky glue, which the tacky glue is stronger. The museum gel is less visible. I also, more importantly, I use things like paper clips, little weights and things like that to bend them to weight. So part of what you do with a flower that doesn't want to stay in position is you talk to it nicely, but you also moisten it gently and put a little weight on it, and in a little bit it will relax and assume the shape you want. Judy wants to know, where do I get my poppies? Well, primarily I grow them. And incidentally, that live photography portion of the webinar Phyllis just put in the chat has a demonstration of the photography itself, so you can see the setup there. Yeah, so I grow them. Poppies are difficult to buy from a florist or from Trader Joe's or some place like that because their shelf life is so limited. To have a really exotic kind of poppy, the only way you're going to have it is to grow it. If you're looking for a good source for small plants, for seedlings, poppy seedlings, try annuals, annuals, and perennials. Phyllis is ahead of me there. Based in Richmond, California, they do a nice mail order business as well. And Maria, can you have Farm Girl deliver me some peonies? I love peonies too. Yeah, I think I include these two to say you don't necessarily need a fancy camera. Here's some iPhone photography of my poppies. For whatever it's worth, I'm going to throw out that the beautiful red ones here are Papaver somniferums, which are opium poppies, the growing and cultivation for gardens being perfectly legal in this country. So here's another common pattern, which is basically a sort of painting with petals. And part of the point of this composition is that the Gaillardia, the yellow petals, and the Nemesia are complementary colors. So when you do this kind of thing, you want to look for color combinations that use the color wheel with complementary and supplemental colors. One of the things I keep in my studio is a color wheel. Donald wants to know any advice on how much to stop down. It's an interesting question. So at normal distances, if you can achieve perpendicularity, that means like this to your subject is pretty flat. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Your subject is pretty flat. So you don't really need much depth of field. I find it depends on the lens you have. You know, lenses that are not first rate, anything but the really top of the line lenses work best optically between f8 and f11, basically in middle of the range. So if I don't need the depth of field, I will use a lens that's not particularly wonderful at f8 or f11. However, why not use a wonderful lens? So I tend to use the prime Zeiss Otis 55 millimeter lens for this work. And I stop that lens all the way down. Usually I shoot it at either f16 or f11 because it works perfectly. It's perfectly beautiful at those settings. And that way I even have to worry less than usual about any depth of field issues. This is one of the images I have teed up to be a actual example when we get there of these two, because you'll see you'll see. Here's an example of a three-dimensional light box setup photographed with a light box behind these birds from Birds of Paradise, also from our garden. I was just noticing last time I was out there that we have a whole new crop of wonderful Birds of Paradise on the bush. And in this kind of photography, Donald, you would want to stop down all the way, of course, because there's a fair amount of depth of field range from the front of the table in white on the bottom to the back. And I don't focus stack with this kind of work. Yeah, you know, focus stacking is one of those techniques. There's a section on it in Creative Garden Photography on how to focus stack. It comes up for me most often in extreme macro photography where you get very close and depth of field gets very limited. This really isn't extreme macro photography, and there's no need for focus stacking. If you stop to think about the business of high key HDR, you're exposure blending already. So let's say you have 7 exposures. If you also have to focus stack with 10 different images for different focus points, that becomes a heck of a lot of images, 70 by my multiplication, to keep track of and deal with. If there are ways to systematize that, there's a piece of software called PT GUI that will both do the HDR and the focus stacking simultaneously if you photograph them in the right order. But generally, the rule with focus stacking is don't do it unless you have to. And then when you have to, it's a lifesaver because you can get things in focus that couldn't possibly be in focus other ways. But think one of the wonderful, here's a profound thought for you. One of the wonderful things about digital photography is you can combine exposures, captures in post-production. Well, let's see, what can you combine? You can combine exposures, exposure blending, that's sometimes known as HDR or high dynamic range photography. You can also combine photographs shot over time. For example, stacking star trail exposures. That's a form of time stacking, basically. Then you can also combine focal ranges, and that's focus stacking. So it's profoundly useful when you have to do it that you can do these things. But generally, if you can do it in camera, you're going to save yourself time and grief. Judy wants to know, how do you get the stems down with the flower flat on the light box? Do you cut them off? If that's the only way I can do it, absolutely. And so I think your question here, Judy, is really, if you look at this image with these nice poppies, popovers from my garden, the buds are facing front, but the stalks are going up like that. In real life, that mostly wouldn't be the case. The flowers would be facing the sun, they're heliotropic, and they're looking up. So yes, in this case, I cut off the blossom and I put the flowers on the blossom. We're going to be doing a webinar, hopefully to celebrate more freedom in our lives, on May 15th, One Flower, One Garden, One World. By that time, I should have this year's crop of poppies growing along my garden path up to the front door. And in that webinar, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to gather the flowers, and, I have to say, deity willing, and place them on the light box, so you'll be able to see exactly how I do that. And here's a wider panorama view. With this image, I photographed it in 2 panels and then combined it. So this would have been about 10 total captures. Here we put the moth on the image. These are sweet peas. Do poppies grow in Florida? Great question, John. Yes, but you really want to be careful about growing them and buy some from Annie's mail order. I have a student who lives in Florida, somewhere not far from West Palm Beach, who in fact was really like, I can't photograph poppies. How can I grow them in Florida? He got some mail order and has been happily growing and photographing them ever since. How do you put 2 panels together and PT GUI? Phyllis, would you mind putting the spelling of PT GUI, and if you can find it quickly, the link for it up in the box? PTGUI. It's a Belgian software company. How do you put 2 panels together? You do it in Photoshop by digital stitching. So, and this is something I suppose we could do a webinar on. The process is you take each side, each panel, and the most I've really ever done this with is 5 panels. And believe me, that's a mind twister. So you take each panel and you develop it. You do the layers you have in it, say the 7 layers. You try to be consistent between the panels so that they come out the same. Then you see how big this would be if you would combine them all left to right. You do the math and you create a new document for the background layer in Photoshop. That's the width of the whole thing. And then you place each panel on them, hopefully seamlessly, overlay them so they're aligned, and do what you have to do with retouching, clone stamp tool, and so on, to make sure that the blending as in this image is seamless and that no one can see where you split it. This one was split right down the middle. And one of the things to be careful about when you conceptualize an image like this is that the middle crossing doesn't have too much detail. So because that's the detail in combining is where you can get into trouble. Haha. high, gestural. I look for flowers that have personality. You have to spend a little time with them to understand what their personalities are. Here it's the arms of this one. It's some nice, daffodils. Here it's someone was talking about peonies a little while ago. Some of my favorite, not very translucent, but an outrageously beautiful flower to photograph. The leaves are translucent though. Incidentally, this last series of flowers like these tulips have been put on a scanned paper background. It's one of the things I hope that we get to in post-production. Here's another panorama. This is 2 panels of tulips here combined. And yet another one. This is this is an assemblage that resembles an entire garden. And another panorama. I'm into panoramas today, I guess. This one I call Into the Vortex of the Universe. This is a bouquet formation that I made this one for Phyllis. It's a bouquet for Phyllis. Primarily tulips, but also anemones. And here we have an example of an LAB-L channel inversion. So here's the photograph on a white background. Here's the inversion in LAB. A mandala is one of the other common patterns. Here's an example, another mandala with the maple leaves, flowers, and various other things on the light box. So a variation of the mandala is a wreath. Here's a mandala with a proteus at the center, and then Alstroemeria petals arranged in a basically a circular star pattern around it. Thank you for putting the Creative LAB course at LinkedIn Learning up. That's a good resource. Very well organized course, if I say so myself. And here's one I did recently for yet another kind of pattern, a sort of box. And here's the LAB-L channel inversion of that. And I think this may be the last slide in the slideshow. It's not exactly a pattern like this, but here's a New Year's good luck dragon in LAB-L channel inversion. This is a discount code for my garden photography book if you get it directly from the publisher, Garden 40. And before we move on to our movie, are there any questions? Bruce, is it possible to use on one photo raw or capture, or will I have to go back to Adobe products? You know, I think you can do it with on one. I understand the irritation with Adobe, sincerely. You know, the part of there are 2 things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to convert a raw capture. You can do that in Capture One. You can do that in On One. And you need to be able to use layers and masking conveniently. From my viewpoint, I don't necessarily use the most current versions of Photoshop or Adobe products. You know, I'm not the kind of person who is totally into gadgets or latest and greatest. I care about the results I get, not so much, you know, the tools I use are my paintbrushes, but I'm not going to fetishize them. It's not what it's about for me. But so, you know, Photoshop is the industry standard. They really have layers and masking down. I've been using it for years. So there's not much reason why I would switch for me. But you know, if you can do layers and masking, then you can do this. There's nothing inherently super about the techniques involved. Phyllis, could you address John's question about cleaning the top of a light box, which is
Oh,
something that comes up for us a lot?
right, especially when you have the sticky sap from sunflowers and things. We found that rubbing alcohol, just, with a piece of paper towel or something, and you just kind of gently rub away at it and it goes away. It works really well.
Yeah, first pass. I mean, if I'm going to photograph flowers that aren't too messy, maybe they leave a little pollen, but not much. I will use a piece of paper towel and a damp piece of paper towel and then dry it, and that seems to work fine. But as Phyllis said, there are some things that are really sticky. Sunflowers turn out to have really sticky sap, for example, and also we've been doing fruits and vegetables on the light box lately, and in fact, there's a newly posted recording of that up if you weren't there for the live webinar. And that stuff gets messy. It's like having one's dinner on the light box, and rubbing alcohol works.
All right, so I'll play the movie. There you go. You want me to play the next one, Harold?
Please.
All right. I'm just trying to get it lined up here. This is
Judy says the tulip heads look blurred, and possibly that's via Zoom issue, or
yeah,
what,
probably.
or the camera we use to make the movie. Tripod used to shoot straight down. This is a really right stuff studio weight tripod. I think the MK3, MK4, but any good tripod should be able to shoot straight down. There are a lot of brands. Gitzo is a good tripod brand. What ISO, if not able to use 64? That's from Denzel. If use the native ISO of your camera, which with my Nikon D850, that's 64, and with the Z6, Z7, it's also 64. With many cameras, it's ISO 100, some it's ISO 200. Just use whatever the lowest stated ISO is, and that's fine. You don't want to boost the ISO too much because you're going to add grain. But on the other hand, in this kind of photography, you're on a tripod anyhow. There's no virtue for raising the ISO. Yeah, I'm not sure what it is for the Canon 5 DSR. You'll have to look at the manual, but probably 100 is my guess if it doesn't have 64. Yeah, and Sylvia puts a sheet of glass or clear plexi in front of the light box. Yeah, that would keep the light box clean, but of course it doesn't keep your sheet of glass or plexi clean, which is sometimes the problem I have with the whole issue of putting a filter, a clear filter, to protect the front of one's lens, which I don't really do. But sure, it protects the front of your lens, except you have to keep it clean, and that now you have an additional piece of stuff between you and the world. Do you use an app when changing settings so you don't have movement ghosting? Mary Louise, that's a great question. I don't myself, actually. I've developed a fairly light touch, and I just twiddle the shutter speed dial between exposures. But some people have problems with that, and almost every camera will do auto bracketing for you, so you can set that up in a program. You don't really need an app. You can do it within camera, but you can also, if you're controlling your camera using an app, as many people do, and some cameras do, you can also do it from an app. There are many ways to roam. I use a remote release on my camera, so that's an important issue. And if you're using a mirror camera, you need either to be shooting with the mirror lockup on, so that that's not an issue, so that mirror movement is not an issue, or you need to be using live view mode so that the mirror isn't an issue. And yes, absolutely, manual focus. There's no place for autofocus in this kind of photography, thank God. Phyllis, you have another movie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, should I play the next one?
Please.
All right. There you go.
Thank you, Phyllis. Let us start with this guy. And Phyllis, what size is my light box? Which light box? You can't be too rich, too thin, or have too big a light box, generally speaking.
The biggest one you have is pretty big. I think it's like, oh, geez, 26 by 40, something like that. It's the biggest
Something
light
like
pad
that.
we could find.
Yeah, it's the one on the Mandala. It's the biggest commercially available one. Someday, one of these days, I'm going to custom design a room for this. We'll see. I'm not kidding either. So yeah, because that'd be great. If you custom designed a room for it, you could kind of have some kind of porch or balcony or elevator way up above it. You look down on it with a tripod mount there and a gantry. Um, okay, so I'm going to show the raw files here so that you see what they are, and I'll open up one of them. But what I've prepared so that this doesn't become an excruciating process is reduced versions of the files. But let me show you before we get there. So here's 4 seconds at f16 and ISO 64 using my 55 millimeter prime Otis. You'll notice here is 2 seconds, here's 1 second. You'll notice that I have background outside the light box in the photos, which incidentally doesn't matter. And I'll show you why it doesn't matter in a bit. Okay, but keep that in mind. Here's half a second, and here is a quarter of a second. You know, when you look at the lighter versions, of course, there is a certain amount of softness because resolution comes in with proper exposure, but this is too dark. So somewhat you can't have it both ways. So that's one of the issues with this kind of photography. Here's a 15th of a second. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 exposures ranging from 4 seconds here to a 15th of a second. And Maria, I was just about to get to that. Mostly I make no ACR adjustments. So here's this image in ACR, and the next thing I would do is click open copy in Photoshop. And there, I don't change the given ACR settings for this kind of photography. I just take it as it is. And this will open it in Photoshop. So here's our brightest one. And the first thing you want to do here is paint out things like the background that you don't want and tripod legs, anything like that. So I'm going to do the brush tool. I put opacity at 100%. I put flow at 100%. I sample the white of the background and make sure it's the foreground color. And then I go like that. Okay, I may need to make my brush a bit smaller. You can So one of the reasons for doing this, besides that you might have something like a tripod leg in a place that you don't want it, is to, you can see your image better if it's all on white, if it's not on something that's kind of cockeyed with strange bits and pieces around it. Now what happens is when I go and I take my next one, this is the 2-second one. Hold on a sec. Before I do anything else, let me label this one first of all. So let's say it's the 4-second exposure. And then I am going to copy and align the 2-second exposure over it like that. And those of you who have closed down the 2-second version, those of you who have done this with me before know that there are two easy ways to copy and align layers in Photoshop. One is with your source image, you go select all, then you go edit copy, then you move to the place you want to paste it and you go edit paste. That works. The other is with the move tool selected, you click in the one you want to move, you keep the shift key down, you move it over the layers you want to do, you let go of the mouse, then you let go of the shift key. That's what I just did, but obviously you can't see me doing it when it's keyboard stuff. So what I like to do a lot of the time, of course, in Photoshop, there are keyboard shortcuts for almost everything. I like to try to do it when I'm showing it to demonstrate over Zoom, I like to try and do it via the menus because I can call out what those are and everyone can see it. So here we're going to add a hide all layer mask to this. Layer, layer mask, hide all, like that. Now what I'm going to do is, first of all, observe that the parts of the background I didn't want are painted out. I am going to take my brush tool. I'm going to leave opacity and flow where they are. I'm going to make my tool considerably harder, maybe 30%, and I am going to paint in the swoosh. I am painting in the swoosh. Okay. Everybody see what I'm doing here? So here's the 4-second layer alone. Here's the 2-second layer. Here is what the layer mask looks like. Very simple, right? I have a question there, which I was sort of meaning to answer from Judy. What is the swish? Well, these flowers that I have here. I was collecting dried flowers basically for a while, and these are a sort of what's the word? Melange. That's a good word. Collation of dried flowers on the light box. So let's go grab the next one. So this is 1-second exposure. Make it bearable in size. I have the move key, hold down the shift key, pull it over, let go of the move key, let go of the move tool. And here you go. Now this time around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the layer mask I already made from the last one. I hold down the Alt key to move the layer mask up like that. And generally, let's see. So one thing we see here when we do this is that we're getting a bit of the background here showing through. So I'm going to just paint it out on the layer mask like that. And I'm going to do the same thing here like that. I don't know if you can see any of that. Okay. But one thing, as you go up the wedding cake, that's the layer stack, successive layers should be a bit less opaque. So while I could use the same mask here, I'm going to put the opacity down to about 50%. Yeah, but we'll make it 60, 70%. Why not? Like that. Now let me go grab the next layer. So the process here is designed to create a translucent look. So you don't want to go off the reservation too much. Once it starts getting too dark, that's the end of this, really. So this is 1/2 second, 0.5 of a second, like that. And let's see, I'll shut it down. I'll like that. And I'm going to put the swoosh mask back up, and we'll put the opacity on this one to 50%. Actually, that's pretty good. Let's look at this a little closer. Let's say we'll look at this part of it. Okay. So here's where I started at 4 seconds. I added 2 seconds. I've added 1 second, and I've added 1/2 second I think that's really, well, I tell you what, let's just add one more. Ron wants to know before I add the next one, how do I keep the flower petals or flower heads from wilting during the development of a floral layout? Or is it a consideration? Ron, yes, absolutely a consideration. In this case, most of these are dried anyhow. But you know, with something like a very evanescent poppy, that once you cut it and put it on a light box, it maybe has half an hour of life. Yeah, you have to be really careful about it. I think that rubbing down the surface of the petals with a little bit gently with a little bit of warm water can help preserve them. And you know, sometimes I sing to them. Um, I'm actually not kidding about that. If you talking to them helps, it helps me. I don't know if it helps them. Uh, Maria, did you copy the 1 second layer to the 0.5 mask or copy the 2 second layer to the 5 mask? Sorry, I looked down when you did it. Does it matter? No, but keeping this stuff straight is important. So I copied the 2 second exposure over the 4 second exposure, and I created the mask that I used there for the 2 second exposure. Next, I copied the 1 second exposure over, and I copied the mask up. Then I copied the half a second exposure and I copied the mask up. One's not always lucky enough to be able to use the same mask repeatedly. Partly I did it in this example. I chose this example knowing I'd be able to do that so that I wouldn't have to stop and paint a mask for each one. Partly it's because the shape of this swish is so simple. You know, it's just a simple swirl, which is more regular. You can see in this quarter of a second one here, the background is starting to get a pretty different and bluer color than before as the exposure goes down. So you really are going to want to be careful here. This is a quarter of a second, not to infiltrate into your exposure. So let me shut it. Let me put that down. Now I'm going to put a hide all layer mask on. Hide all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in close and I'm going to manually paint in a bit. So I get to make white my foreground color. I'm going to paint it in at 50% flow and about 33% opacity, and I'm going to find areas that look like they need it, that the rest of the stuff has overlooked, forgotten, or missed, which can happen. And the ideal here would be just to follow along your swoosh trail, which can be a little hard on a laptop screen to see what on earth one's doing, but on a bigger monitor is not so hard. So once I'm happy with this, and in real life, I might be a little more careful and take a little longer. Judy asks, can you repeat how you got rid of black and align layers after the first? I will proceed to another example after this one, Judy. I think that would be the best way to do that. And of course, there'll be the recording you could look at too later on. Yes, sometimes one could do a selection and fill versus using a brush so as to avoid getting the darker background showing up on the layer. Of course, the problem of getting the selection exactly right is not so different from the problem of painting on the layer mask. But sure, and there are a variety of ways to go about it. One of the things that's exciting and fun about Photoshop, in point of fact, is that there always are multiple ways to do everything. And yes, that could work. So one thing I would do next here is archive this layer as a layered document before moving on. So let's do that because it is not a high resolution document, and I'm going to save it as, and I'll call it, which I do. I'm just demonstrating this because I want to show the importance of archiving before you layer down in case you want to go back to where you were. From here, I'm going to flatten my image, layer, flatten my image, and I do a save as. So I'm going to call it save as A. And there are many things I could demonstrate with this image, but what I am going to demonstrate, first of all, I'm going to crop it because there's a lot of extra white here, and then I'm going to move it into LAB color and invert the L channel and put it on a black background, and then we'll move on to another example. Judy wants to know, any advantage to PSD over TIFF for your layers? No, not really. I mean, you use whichever file format you prefer. They do the same thing with layers. Sort of a matter of habit for me, but it doesn't really matter. So there, that's a rough crop. And again, actually, I would save this separately. I save every step that I move along, which has proved to be a valuable thing to do for a bunch of reasons, even though it takes up extra space. So the first time you convert an image to LAB color, you want to go Edit, Convert to Profile, and you pick LAB color as the destination photo space. And the engine should be Adobe Ace, the intent relative color metric, and you want to make sure the use black point compensation box is checked. Okay. To flip the blacks for whites and the whites for blacks, you highlight the lightness channel, make sure all channels are visible. The eyeballs of visibility, the channels that are highlighted are the ones that are selected and therefore acted on. And you go Image, Adjustment, Invert. Okay, pretty slick, right? And pretty fast too. Now let's say that some of our swoosh of flowers is too dark here. So what you can do is you can make sure that all 3 LAB channels are selected. You can duplicate your layer and you can apply a curve adjustment. Image, Adjustment, Curves. You pull the top of the curve up like that. And layer mask, hide all. Take a brush and paint in the parts of this that you feel are too dark. So it's a pretty straightforward image, and this is actually a pretty straightforward process, but I like it on black. So just to go back through the, well, let's see, how do we do this? There's the adjustment in LAB that got it brighter. And if you wanted to go back a ways, you could go back before you inverted. There it is on white. Here it is fully on black. Thanks, Phyllis, for that musical edification. Are there questions about this before I move on to another example? No questions. Well, I look forward to seeing all kinds of cool stuff then based on this. Let's see. It seem to have a reduced one for that. Okay, this would be a decent one to work on. Let's see, what have we got here? 37, okay. Okay, so here's the 8-second exposure, f16, ISO 64. Not much there, really. 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, half a second, quarter of a second, 1/8 of a second, 15th of a second, 30th of a second. You know, with these raw files, it's taking them a while to resolve as I go through them. So there was that interesting line in my exposure summary, reserve an HDR blend. So let's do it with this one. Exposures ranging from 8 seconds to 1/30th of a second. I'm going to send this to HDR FX Pro 2 from Nick. And generally speaking, with the automated software, and it really doesn't matter whether you run Photoshop, Aurora, Lightroom, it's going to do with these, it's just going to make them too dark. So the task here, because it reads the dark side stuff as well as the right side stuff, the task here is going to be to lift the exposure before we do anything much more. And you can do that using the exposure slider here. And that's a little more human. And make the highlights brighter, make the whites whiter, make the blacks darker. I like that, like that. Denzel wants to know, are my step-by-step explanations explained in a similar manner in your book? Yes, but better, because I had to take the time to stop and write it all down with pictures rather than showing it. But honestly, this is, yes, the book does a pretty good job of it, and it's pretty thorough. But on the other hand, this is not really simple stuff. So, you know, what I have found with students who have gone through the book is that sometimes they come back to the recordings or even a live webinar, or even send me a JPEG or two and ask questions. But yes, the book does a pretty complete job of it. Yeah, no, I'm under no illusions that this is easy. I like to say to people, and you know, I mean this, if it were easy, everyone would do it. And at some level, you know, sort of lowest common denominator, lightbox photography is easy. What's not easy is really producing a compelling and interesting and technically sophisticated images with it. Thank you, Deborah. Great comment. Appreciate it. So let's save off this HDR version here so we know what it is. And I will save it as a PSD. I will go find the right example. Which I don't remember what it is, which is always a problem. I think that, now let's see, 9 knows. Nope. Yeah, here it is. I'm going to create a new folder for this. We'll call it WIP. Create, and this is pick HDR. Yeah, I think, Pam, that's a great idea about saving a reference image. I also should say here that I make a point of overshooting. By overshooting, I mean, you know, this sequence, for example, went from 8 seconds to 30th of a second. You don't really need an eighth of a second to a 30th of a second. That's pretty unlikely. So, and in fact, in the last one that we just converted, we didn't use all of them. So, but on the other hand, as I say, this when I was doing in-person workshops before the pandemic, this was a constant refrain. Film is so expensive. You know, if you're here, the really expensive thing in photography is getting the setup and getting you to the place or there. Once you're in a place, once you have a setup, do all the exposures you think you might ever possibly want, because you're never going to get it back the same way again. So I'm going to run through the same routine I did last time in terms of painting in the image, painting out the stuff we don't want. So here I go. This is the 8-second exposure. And I'm not quite sure why it's coming up white. That's not right. Let's see what we can do about that. Well, I think there is no way out of this. I'm going to have to shut Photoshop down and reopen it. Because we just popped there. I mean, it's not unwhite, but it's not white. It's not totally dark. I'm beginning to lose my I have to get in at least one more example after this, though. Get so many prepared. Okay, that's better. Now, I think someone was asking about how I paint out the surrounding background with this lighter one. So, couple of steps. I sample the background color. It's not quite white. I want to make sure I match it. Take my brush tool, put it, flow to 100%, opacity to 100%, and doesn't really matter what hardness I have, and just paint out the unfortunate elements that creep into any photo of this sort. Partly so you can look at it without distractions, and partly because you might not want them in the final image. Okay. Let's just label what we have. This was 8 seconds. And now I'm going to put the 4-second version over the 8-second version. Oops, I mislabeled them, I think. Let's see. Yep. This is 8 seconds here. This one is 4 seconds. Okay. And I'm gonna shut that down. Layer mask, hide all. And now what we do is we paint in at a fairly high opacity and flow the parts we want here, like that. So I wasn't being very precise here, but you get the idea. Here it is with nothing. Here it is with a bit more. Let's zoom in on this. I'm not trying to create a perfect work of art. I am trying to show the overall techniques. Okay, so let me pull in another layer, and I see a request from Judy to show this a little more slowly. And we'll do that. So this would be the 2-second layer. So I select the Move tool from the tool panel. I hold down the Shift key. I click on the 2-second layer. I drag it over the top. I let go of the mouse, and I let go of the Shift key. And next one I do, I will show using the other method, which is less opaque, sort of. So this is the 2-second layer. I'm going to put a layer mask, hide all onto it, and I'm going to start painting in, but a little less, with a little less opacity. And a smaller brush so I can do it more selectively. Begin to see the outlines of this come into place now. So let's go get the next one. This would be the 1-second one. Okay, instead of doing that, I was reaching for that. This is called the source. This is the 1-second one. I'm going to go select all. It's now selected. I'm going to go edit, copy. Note there are keyboard shortcuts for all of this. Then I'm going to go to this one, the target, the layer stack, and I'm going to go edit, paste. Okay, so that's another way to do that. 1 second. That's right. You don't need to paint away. Judy says you did not seem to need to paint away black after layer 1. That is exactly right. That's part of the power and beauty of this, because the hide all layer masks hides what you've done. You aren't going to need to do it again. That's exactly right. Layer mask, hide all. See, I just put the hide all layer mask on, and it hides that area because I don't need it. And here we go. Now remember that we reserved, quote unquote, an HDR blend of this. So I'm going to go find that. And I'll put it on top of this. Remember, there was a reserve that for the top of the layer stack. Oops, what happened there? Okay. a profile mismatch showing on my other monitor. Don't care about that. There we go. Let's do that again. Okay, so this is the HDR blend. Okay, let me answer a couple of questions before I go on. Judy wants to know, does any HDR program give a result as good as your Photoshop layering an individual work, in my opinion? No, absolutely not. Of course not. It really can't. It's not designed to do that. But it could be a useful adjunct in parts to what you do with the hand layering. You know, the idea here is, in many ways, is to have as many artistic options as you possibly can. So what one is creating is a palette of possibilities. There's no such thing as having the computer know what you want to do by reading your mind. These beautiful boxes we have, these darkroom in a computer, the Photoshop darkroom doesn't read our minds. We have to decide. So I see a lot of questions here. Let me try to sort of scoop through them and then move on. I noticed you didn't copy layer masks in this one. Yes, I wanted to demonstrate not copying layer masks. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. It depends whether you can use the duplicated information. Deborah, great comment. Is the idea to get the image with as much color as you can, but maintain the translucency? That's right. That is an important part of the concept here. Also, what you have is pinpoint exposure control. Some less translucent flowers, you know, for example, in this image, this area of the rose here, this area of this poppy here are darker. They need lighter exposure. So you won't give them the darker exposure using layer mask, but you will give the lighter ones. What's the strategy for which areas to paint on which layers? It's really not dark as first. It's what we just said. It's that when you have darker things, you're going to not want to give them darker exposures. You're going to want to stop sooner. And yes, the idea here is to get as much color as you can while still preserving translucency. Let me go ahead and put my hide all layer mask on here. And then generally with the HDR blend, you aren't going to want to paint in too much opacity there, maybe 30%, like that. And you want to pick areas that don't seem defined enough and paint those in, and you want to leave alone the ones that are okay without it. So this is a very selective issue. And yeah, part of why I didn't paint in this, copy the layer mask this time, was I wanted to demonstrate an alternative here, which is just painting it each time. Phyllis is telling me that we have other things to do in our life besides these webinars. Is that possible? And I should try it. Well, okay, I've got at least one. Phyllis, do you mind if I do one more example after this?
Oh, absolutely. Go to it. I mean, you just told me to give you a little poke when it was an hour and a half, because, you know, we don't want to tire people out too much.
Let alone me.
Oh, you have boundless energy. Not tired. Maria says not tired. Thank you, Maria. And Maria also asks, can you recommend other HDR creation tools?
Besides,
Chris, I'm retired, no times constraints.
Oh, no comment.
Oh, there you go. Deborah says I could listen to Harold all day. There you go. Well, if you go to Harold's YouTube channel, you could just put everything on play and let it roll.
Um, about HDR tools, they're all pretty much the same, honest to God. Some people swear by Aurora. None of them are going to really get you where you want to go without some manual intervention. Except sometimes they get it right, but I think it's luck as much as anything else. The tools in Lightroom and Photoshop for HDR have come a long way from where they were even a few years ago, though. They're much better than they used to be. Let's layer this one down, and I'm not even going to save it, but no, in real life I'd save it. And now I'm going to apply a filter effect, and this is one that I use often to enhance color. So I duplicate a layer. Always apply a filter on a duplicate layer. Don't do it on the original layer. That will give you control to do it selectively. I am going to pull up Topaz Adjust, and note that I'm running this as a standalone plugin. It's on the Vibrant Collection tab, the one I want, of the standalone Adjust, but you can also access this via the Topaz Studio product as well. The one I've selected here is called Detailed Color, and I use this quite a bit. I like it a lot. There you go. So if you only used detailed color at 100%, I think people would find that it's a little bit corny. They're not terrible in some ways. So that's what we just did. But what I would like to do generally with this kind of thing is put a hide all layer mask on and paint it in selectively, maybe at about 40% opacity. Actually, in real life, and I know this is going to be a question, so I'll answer it now, I would vary opacity depending on where. So the object here is to get this sort of just at the tip of the tongue of visualization. So you want it to be at a place where people know that you're doing something, but they don't quite know what it is. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Let's paint out some of it using black. Let me get my brush a little smaller and more meticulous. So you don't want things to look kind of edgy. You want to be able to see. Now let's have a close-up look at what this is like. Okay. So that's a powerful tool for getting, as somebody said earlier, a little more color out of it while still being translucent. And of course, sometimes I do reduce the overall opacity of the layer. Like you might say, that's just a bit too much. Let's put it down to 50%. And in fact, in real life, I'd probably like this more. So any questions or comments about this example before I move on to another one?
Give folks a second to type it up if they have something. I could start singing, but that wouldn't be a good idea.
Why not? You have such a nice voice, Phyllis.
Oh, thank you. But I don't know if it's a singing voice.
Works for me. Now, I have something in mind here. Let's see if I can find it. Not that one. Ah, this be the one. This be the R. This be the R. Okay. Judy wants to know, have I ever used Photomatics for HDR? Yeah, I have. Back in the day. Once upon a time, it was really fine. I'm joking around, but there was a time at which Photomatics was essentially the only way to go for HDR. Um, I can't say as I've used it in a few years. It's a good program. It's as good as any of the others. They were there first, though. I think if I had to choose one today, it would either be Nik HDR or Aurora. Aurora has put most effort into innovating on this. I think it's only good for Mac, though, which may be a drawback for some people. Okay, so we've got, with this sweet poppy pear here, we've got 0.6 of a second. The exposure is at f22, and it's with a 135 millimeter lens with a extension tube on the lens for close-up photography. This is a nice Zeiss telephoto lens, and it's a good way to photograph this kind of thing without getting too far down and close to it. And let's see what else we have here. And okay. All right, so there are two different things I want to show you here. First of all, here's the reduced sequence, the 0.6 of exposure, the 1 second exposure, and the 2 second exposure. In this case, I pretty much can go with my 1 second and 3/5 of a second exposure. I don't really see that the 2 second exposure adds anything much for me. So let's open up the 1 second exposure. And really, this is pretty good. Okay. Now, I'm going to open up the 3/5 of a second exposure. You can see that when I was making these images, I could see that I didn't need a whole lot of exposures for this because it was basically uniform enough that a short amount of exposures worked just fine. Really, I really only want to paint in a small bit of this in the, you'll see. Okay, so this is 0.6 second exposure. And let me get rid of this. It's confusing. For now, I will put that down. I'll make this a little bigger. I'm going to put a layer mask on top, layer mask, hide all. And JD, would you like me to go over copying that layer again? I think that's a yes. I'll take it as a yes. Let me delete it here. And let me go find it. Okay. So I select the 0.6 second one. I make sure that the move tool is here in the tool panel. I click up on the bar there. I pull it over, drag it over, let go of the mouse, let go of the shift tool. That order at the end is important. Oops, I didn't mean to close it, but I did. That's okay. So the only thing I'm going to do here is paint in a bit of get the border ends of the flowers a little darker. That's all. Layer mask, hide all. And let's see. Let me make sure my brush is nice and soft, and it's a little bit big here. You can use the bracket keys on the keyboard to visually see what size you want your brush to be. You don't have to do it by entering numbers in there. Just painting a little bit more of the blush color onto these nice poppies. There you go. That's all I'm doing there. All right. Now, here's the bonus feature. What I would like is this area here. I want to get a lot more of an illusion of translucency. Let me go back and open up the 6-second one a bit again. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to, first of all, I'm going to crop this a bit so that it's like this. That's fine. I'm really just interested in grabbing this part, as you'll see in a second. And I've cropped it. Now I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to flip it horizontally like that. And now I'm going to pull this over the petal that's underneath there. Okay, so to see what I'm doing here, first of all, you want to make sure when you do this kind of stuff that snap is off, because snap will align it where you don't want it. Never trust anything that's magical when you don't know where it keeps its brain. It's the Arthur Weasley principle. Turn off all automatic stuff and everything. So I am now aligning this right above the petal of the poppy here. I'll put the opacity back up to 100%. I'll put a hide all layer mask on it, layer mask, hide all, and very softly, very subtly, I will paint in translucency on that petal there. So I want to make sure that everyone can see what I just did. So here was my original poppy. Here I painted in some darkness around the petals, and here I just painted in some real translucency along the petals. Make sense to everybody? I am going to archive this. Save as. We will call it layered.
And Harold, Judy would like to know, why did that make it translucent?
Yeah, I see that question. It's not 100% clear to me whether the question is, I'm not sure what your question is. I mean, do you see how the effect worked?
I think,
there's it off.
Harold,
There's it off.
you're, if you zoom in on that area, what Harold's doing.
No, she says she sees it. So it's the question, how come that did it? Or I will zoom in on the area, or
maybe if you show
Gwen says wonderful, thanks a lot.
Maybe if you
yes,
show.
How come it works? Okay, I got the question.
Okay.
Yeah. So the deity's eye is on the sparrow, but the deity doesn't know when it's a layer, visually, whether it's above or below the layer. So it worked because I added a comparable color above the layer. I was judicious about how I did it. I didn't overdo the effect. But if you see something coming through an already freely translucent layer and it looks like what it is on the bottom, the optical illusion is that it's going to become translucent. Yes, Deborah, it added more color to the bottom petal, and it also added the same pattern as is there already. Okay, so I look for opportunities to do this kind of thing in these images. Doesn't always come up, but where it does, you can actually paint in essentially translucency. The slide that I sometimes use to discuss this further discusses the Renaissance painting techniques of chiaroscuro, which Leonardo and others developed to present an illusion of depth by contrasting dark and light colors. Essentially, this is a chiaroscuro post-production painting technique. So let's see, I want to save this, and I'm going to layer it down by flattening the image. And what I now want to do is I want to put this on a scanned paper background, and we'll leave that afterwards as the last technique here. So here's a piece of paper. And when I say piece of paper, I kind of mean a piece of paper. uh, what I did for this is I found a nice yellowed piece of paper, and I put it on a flatbed scanner, and I made a scan of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the recipe for how to place a image on white onto a scanned background. I did further modifications to this particular background by, as you can see, it's got a sort of lighter ring in the center. That came by blending a white layer with it and using a layer mask there. You know, there are all kinds of things you can do with this, and I actually recommend, for finding things that you can scan to make backgrounds, a good paper store or a place like an art supply store, if you have one in your area, can work wonders, or just things you have around. You can also use, excuse me for a second, the textures in libraries that companies like Flypaper or Florabella, or actually Adobe and Photoshop provide. Many of them also provide texture files you can use as backgrounds. Oh, thank you, Phyllis. So first thing you want to do is make sure that your background has the same bit depth as the image. So I have a 16-bit background, and normally this would be 16 also, but I modified it to make this easier to work with. Note the difference between a texture and a background. A background is something you put the flowers on, even though my first step will be to copy over them. And a texture is something that overlaying an image. Phyllis, you might put up a link on our website to the LinkedIn background and textures course that I did. Because there's a really complete treatment of this stuff in there. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm changing my bit depth here to 8 bits. And then I'm going to copy the background over my texture like that. And the purpose of copying it over is to size it accurately. Here, we'll make that go bye-bye for now. So edit, transform, scale. I'm not going to be very precise here. I'm just going to pull the lines of it up so that it's scaled like that. When I'm happy with it, I go check. But you can use the texture as a background, right? That's what I'm going to do. This is actually a background, not a texture. But many textures will also work as backgrounds. The definitional distinction is that a background goes beneath the image, as we're about to do, and a texture goes above it as an overlay. Sometimes the same kinds of files can work for both. Sometimes, but not always. The next thing you have to do is to take the background layer in Photoshop and change it into a normal layer, like that. How am I changing the image of us so quickly? I used Edit, Transform, Scale. So I'm now going to move the flowers up the layer stack like that, and I'm going to put the opacity at 15%. Now I'm going to duplicate that layer, duplicate layer, and I'm going to change the blending mode to multiply, and I'm going to change the opacity to 85%. So I am now, I'm not a recipe person very much, but I just gave you a recipe. And this holds true pretty much across the universe of flowers on white or anything on white photography and backgrounds. So the formula is You make sure that your flowers are on a normal Photoshop layer, not a background layer. The paper background is the bottom of the layer stack. The flower is at normal blending mode, 15%. You make a copy of it and you put the copy in multiply blending mode at 85%. Are there questions about this? Or indeed, any question overall in general? Because this is so much fun. This is a technique that I use all the time. I mean, originally I was just doing maybe about 10 years ago when I first started experimenting with this kind of thing. I was originally just presenting them on white backgrounds, and one of my clients said, well, you know, we need it to be on something a little sort of less stark than white. So that's when I learned to start experimenting with backgrounds and textures, and I've been doing it ever since. John, great question. Can you create gradients? Sure, but there's an aesthetic issue there. You know, it has to work with the subject. Judy says one of my books recommended papyrus, and yes, papyrus makes a great background. I use a papyrus background quite a bit. Is this technique in the garden photography book? You know, I don't remember. Let me have a quick look and see. I'm not sure. Do you remember, Phyllis, whether I did any backgrounds in the
I don't remember.
It would be 250, I think, if it's anywhere. Probably not. It's certainly in the LinkedIn Learning course and in a number of the webinars that we've done. Let's see. Yes, I do not think this formula is in the book. A lot of other good information. Okay. Let me just go over this one more time. Copy one of the layer. First of all, I sized the paper by bringing it over the flower image on white, and then I used edit, transform, and to size it correctly, edit, transform, scale to size it correctly. Then I 15% normal, 85% multiply. I almost always use the 1585 formula unless it doesn't look good. But for an image on white on a background, it almost always will be roughly right. It's a good formula. Who came up with it, Phyllis? I think I did.
I think you did, Harold.
Everybody, you know, let me stop screen sharing. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed presenting this, and hope you come and join us if you're interested in this kind of photography for our From the Garden to the Lightbox webinar in mid-May. Let's see. And thanks, everyone. Have fun, stay creative, hang in there. We're at the beginning of the end. I absolutely believe this. Bye, everyone.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.